Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It all depends on which part of the world you are. And my name is Louis Franceschi, Senior Director of Governance and Peace at the Commonwealth here in London. And well, I'm your moderator today. My job is relatively easy. I will introduce the speakers and let them say whatever they want and let you say whatever you want through the chat. We'll be taking care of your questions, your concerns, and there is something that I wanted to say now to set the stage. In 2015, Adam Goodes, an Australian football star, was made Man of the Year. And Alan Woods had to resign to go into retirement because he was booed every time he came into play. And he was booed because he was one of those so-called Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia who had defended himself against the abuse of a 13-year-old girl who shouted at him with racist remarks. Stan Grant, who is a famous journalist in Australia, said in a public debate organized at the Ethics Centre in Australia that Adam Woods had resigned because Australia needed to go into a self-examination. Only 25% of the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders survived colonization. And they are now only 3% of the population, but they are 25% of prisoners. And in juvenile prisons, they are 50%. So it's easy to conclude that they are all criminals, backwards, people who don't have careers, who don't have a future. And Adam Wood says, well, why? And Stan Grant asked himself also the same question. Why is this? And they say, well, because perhaps racism was part of the Australian dream. And this Australian dream has to be now revised, reshaped, repackaged. And well, why did I begin with these questions or with these considerations and perhaps reflections? Because across all colonies, whether French, British, or Spanish, or Portuguese in the whole world, well, we may have been witnesses to the same reality, the reality of racism, of discrimination. We have with us today 5 eminent speakers. I will not tell you much about them because I will let them somehow introduce themselves. We have Dexter Diaz, QC, human rights lawyer and author of the 10 Types of Human. We have also Nana Oyorte, who is the Executive Director of Forward UK. We have Sankara Gao, the Executive Director of Akili Dada. We have Karim Anjawala, the Managing Partner of ALN Kenya and Anjawala Nkana. And Femi Omere, the Executive Director of the ALN Academy. It's very exciting. These are people who bring to us 5 different perspectives. We go to someone who has a huge experience, Nana Oyorte. You are doing a very interesting work with young people, with adolescents. Nana, the floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning from different parts of the world. It's a real pleasure to finally have this event. We've been talking about it for a few weeks, or I would say months. My name is Nana Oyorte, and I'm the Executive Director for Forward, a UK-based African women-led organization. We have been in existence for about 35 years, and I am a Ghanaian British, and I have a passion for seeing African and girls and women thrive. particularly to lead change and to transform their societies. My work I see as quite strategic. As an African diaspora organization, we work to tackle issues around multiple forms of violence, particularly female genital mutilation, child marriage, and other forms of violence. We operate in the UK, so we do work in UK with diaspora communities and policy makers, and we also do exciting work with partnerships in Africa. And so today my real interest is really about why I'm here. And I just want to draw attention to the need for our conversations around COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and the impact in terms of Africa and also in terms of the diaspora. And I think for me, it's important that we stress that we need societies and African societies to take their knees off the heads and backs of African women and girls and allow them to breathe. For so many years, we've had issues around trauma, abuse, injustice, and powerlessness. And this continues to impact adversely on African women and girls globally. And I think we need to put the spotlight on these injustices and explore how we can all work together to accelerate change so that we all can breathe and build and allow women to build the continent that we all want. And I think these are the challenges that I want to focus on, particularly looking at Black Lives Matter, considering the issues around racism, which we've just started to talk about, issues around identity, African women and girls, and really to explore how we can address the structural and systemic barriers that really create these challenges.
I would like to ask Sankara, tell us something about yourself and the very exciting work you are doing with girls in Kenya, in Africa, and also a few ideas on this topic because, well, there are very many people you are and you live with who cannot breathe.
Thank you everyone for joining us at this critical conversation. I'm going to touch on women and girls, which is my specialty and which is what we focus on at Akili Dada. Then I'm also going to talk about Black Lives Matter a little bit. Why does it matter for Africa? Why should we be a part of this conversation? And those are questions that we have seen more often lately on the webs, people asking, if I'm in Kenya, why should I care about what is happening in America? Then I'm going to wrap up with the issue of inequality and a little bit of poverty. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. Do you want me to continue or shall we hear from the rest of us?
No, continue. We cut you.
Excellent. Okay. All right then, no problem. So the issue of Black Lives Matter is an issue that cuts across all continents. The truth is, there has been, the issue of Black Lives Matter has existed way before George Floyd, way before we all witnessed his death and the massive protests that have marred the streets across the world, to be honest. And one of the things that I'd like for us to know is that way before even Martin Luther, there were people like Marcus Garvey who are fighting for Pan-Africanism, who are fighting for the voices of Africans to be heard. The truth is that America has been built on the backs of African slaves. And it is very important for all of us to really understand and know our history, where we come from, because that shapes our future, it shapes our tomorrow, it shapes whatever it is that, there's a saying that says that we are the ancestors of our children for tomorrow and the children for the day after tomorrow. So it is important for all of us to know that whenever people stand up and speak, whenever people stand up and have their voices heard, it has an effect. Sometimes because of where we are, whether it's courtesy of our location or even just access to whatever systems of justice we have, we do not think that it makes an impact, but it does make an impact. A good example is the case of women and girls in Africa, and particularly now during the time of COVID. We have seen that the people who have been, a majority of the people who've been at the front line have been women. Women have been faced by the burden of care for the families now that people are not going to work. Women who are even entrepreneurs who are working in the informal economy, these women do not have access to capital, do not have access to money that is able to sustain the households and the incomes that they are responsible for. And because of this, then it begs the question of the policies that we have within the context of Kenya in particular, and the context of Africa, and I even dare say the world. A lot of our policies are not inclusive policies. A lot of our policies do not ask the important questions, and they do not respond to the important questions. Many of them are on paper, as we already know, but many of them do not cater to the actual need of that woman who is based, whether it's in a slum or whether it's even in an apartment in Manhattan, for example. So what I'd like to really say is that our policies have enabled an environment that doesn't allow a lot of young women and girls to thrive. It actually gives us, it actually leaves women and girls very vulnerable. It leaves us in a situation where we're not able to access capital, we're not able to access education. The opportunities that are there for us to access, we are not even able to access those opportunities. And one of the things that is going to be very critical for young people in Africa right now to do is to rise up and speak, is to rise up and be creative, be innovative, you know, offer your voices, offer your thoughts, offer your intelligence, because we have a lot of that. And I do get the frustration with young people because more often than not, we are not heard. You know, people who are making these decisions for us are people who are way older than us. Yes, you were young once, but we've never been old. So we know how to be young right now. So we have an opinion. We know what it is that we want that can allow us to change and even plug into the system. Towards that also, I'd also like to add on something that is, you know, the issue and the concept of inequality. The truth is that we need to break the silence. We have a lot of bad governance. We have a lot of generational, say, debt, and a lot of inheritance of stereotypes, and a lot of inequality, and even biases, whether conscious or unconscious bias. And more often than not, we have seen and experienced that these biases are actually a stumbling block that are hindering young people from advancing. And you see, when you advance young people are a heritage. In Africa right now, for example, over 75% of the continent's populace is young. In Kenya alone, the average age of Kenya is 18 years old. So you can imagine, for a very young population, a very young country, a majority of the policy stakeholders, a majority of the policy makers are way above even 40, sometimes even in 60, 70. So our frustration is that we want to be heard. We want a system of governance, a system and an order that allows us to not be chosen on the basis of our tribe, basis of our race, basis of our color, our gender, our sexual orientation, or even just on the basis that we don't come from families that are well off. We want an equal opportunity for everybody. And we can begin to do that through just simple empathy. You know, if we can take ourselves and put ourselves in the shoes of where we once were, where we all once were, and where we want our children to sit in the future, the truth is that having empathy is not going to be something that is very difficult. A lot of the wars that we have witnessed, a lot of the disgruntles, a lot of the disagreements, all the way from world peace order, all the way to trade agreements, whether economic, social, or even religious, we have to exercise empathy. Women and girls have a right to healthy environments, we have a right to education, we have a right to food security, we have a right to public participation, whether it's in the form of elections or even running for office. And we also do have a right to inclusion, peace, and security. That is what we are asking for. And I'm going to keep rolling out a couple of my thoughts on some of the things, but I'd allow my fellow panelists, I want to say panelists to chime in and say a couple of things first. Thank you, Louis.
Fantastic, Sankara. We have already got inspired. And we have here, this ties very well with Dexter Diaz. Dexter has written a very interesting book, The 10 Types of Human. We want him to read the whole book here now. Hope you will not do that. But you know, it's very interesting because what you see emerging now with this I can't breathe, discrimination, the situations Sankara was describing very well, is that there are different types of responses, like as if there were different types of human. So why don't you give us some very quick thoughts?
Yeah, certainly. Louis, it's a pleasure to join all of you. Yes, my name is Dexter Dias. I'm Queen's Counsel in the United Kingdom. I'm a human rights lawyer, been a human rights lawyer for about 30 years. And in that time, Louis, I've represented again and again, and I'm frankly sick of it, representing the relatives of what we call here BAME, people of colour who have been killed in state custody with the excessive use of state force and violence, which falls disproportionately on people of colour in the United Kingdom. So the question, and since George Floyd's death, I've done a lot of talking and made a lot of presentations and have lectured about this issue, trying to conceptualize and understand, decode the moment. I gave a lecture at Cambridge here last week. A couple of weeks before that, Ted asked me to do a talk, which I did. What is interesting is the pushback that there was against those presentations. I was trolled, there was a deluge of racism. And one of the things that they kept saying, which I'll share with you, these racist trolls, was go back to where you came from. And so it is a pleasure to join you all in Africa, which is where, of course, we all did come from. Louis, I was really interested in what you said about Australia and the concept of how colonialism has shaped experiences of race. Let me just give you some metrics from the United Kingdom, because the issue is going to be the pushback on Black Lives Matter is, do we live in a post-racial society? And I do research at Cambridge. Recently, I was at Harvard. And at Harvard, a lot of people, the conception is that we do live in a post-racial society. And they would say, well, you look at the fact that they had then a Black president. They not only elected a Black president, Obama, but they re-elected that president. Of course, since then, the middle of the last decade, things have changed somewhat, both on both sides of the Atlantic. And I would want to argue and discuss in the world as well. So here is the issue, I think, for us to discuss. Are we living in a post-racial society where what happened to George Floyd and his very public killing is an outlier? Or do we still live in a highly racialized society, which is structured on a hierarchy of race? Now, in relation to that, the metrics in the United Kingdom, as I say, are pretty bleak, like in Australia. If in the United Kingdom, Black women, I'm trying to look at different generations, I'm trying to look at gender. Black women are twice as likely to be sent to prison as white women for drugs offences. Black children, 6 times more likely to be sent to prison than white children. Black youths, 7.7 times more likely to have the 50,000 volts of a taser shot into their body than a white person. And more generally, the Black population is 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched. So that is one lens to view it in. How do we understand this intractability of highly racialized administration of justice? At the same time, and this is the thing that I think is interesting in trying to decode the moment, at the same time, and there's been Louis, you know, there's been a huge controversy in the United Kingdom within the last week about a particular rapper. I'm sure Femi knows it a lot better than me, someone called Wiley, who went on Twitter and made a lot of very, very disparaging anti-Semitic comments. Now, the thing about that is that an outlier? When you look at the data in the United Kingdom in 2019, more anti-Semitic attacks than in our history. In Canada, the last 4 years, they've had record levels at each year, last 4 years. In the United States, look at the data from the Anti-Defamation League, same thing, last year, record numbers. So we've got an upsurge, not only in racial violence that is color-coded, but also in terms of difference. And I think that is, Louis, incredibly important in trying to understand what is happening and what the implications are for Africa. I think there are bigger transnational, transglobal issues about what this populist moment is about. I've run out of time, I know. I'm over my allotment, Louis. I know that we've got fantastic speakers, but I just put that out there for people to think about and perhaps to have the conversation further about. How is it we understand this moment? Because what we're seeing is an increase of racism and prejudice of all kinds, not just Black, directed or focused, of all kinds. How do we understand that? And I'd like to think about how that impacts Africa. There you go. Anyway, that's a taste. That's the hors d'oeuvre, Louis. That's just the hors d'oeuvre. We've got the main course later, maybe.
You see, we have got an incredible aperitif of the many ideas. Dexter, we will be pinning you down on some of those fantastic ideas.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Yeah, excellent. I want to move now to Karim and Jawala. Now, Karim, you are a practicing advocate in Nairobi, in Africa, really, because you move quite a bit across Africa, even come to Europe very often. Dexter was telling us and setting the ground for the level of discrimination we are witnessing across the spectrum in the whole world. And ask specifically in Africa, the legal environment tends to be quite hierarchical. And is that hierarchy based on race? Is there a racist undertone in the law practice? Of course, this is just to set the tone, but feel free, because I also want you to give a little bit of an introduction of yourself and tell us 2 or 3 key ideas to set the conversation going.
Thank you very much, Reese. It's a real pleasure to join all of you today. Let me quickly say that what I do is I practice law across Africa, commercial law, but I'm also very engaged in rule of law issues. So that's kind of the lens through which I joined today's debate. First, Luis, to respond to the question that you posed, it's interesting that the country whose legal and cultural system was least affected in sub-Saharan Africa by colonialism is the country whose development data is the strongest, and that's Botswana. And so I think there's something to be said for what the legacy of colonialism, both the legal structures it created. So across Africa, for example, the structures of chiefs and so on who control societies, and the displacement of traditional methods of dispute resolution, which meant that there's we are, at least in Commonwealth Africa, what I say, the children of the English when it comes to our legal system. Now there is something to be said for that when it comes to commercial law, but in a whole range of other areas, it is simply an alien law. And Africa has not yet sought to develop its own independent, homegrown solutions to some of the legal and cultural issues that we face. So that's sort of in response to what you just mentioned. I want to approach the question of COVID and Black Lives Matter from a slightly different perspective. I'm obviously based, unlike Dexter, on the continent. And I think the interesting thing about a crisis, which is where we are now, is that it uncovers and paralyzes most those who are least prepared. And at least so far in Africa, it appears that the COVID pandemic is, relative to the rest of the world, least a medical issue in Africa relative to the rest of the world, but to the greatest extent an economic issue. And it's clear that with some notable exceptions, the response of African leadership to the COVID crisis has been sorely lacking. And so in a very real sense, the question, I think, is whether our leaders in Africa, whether to the leaders in Africa, Black lives matter. And I think that, I'm being slightly provocative, but I think that is an important question. Because just as we know that in the US, right over the years with the civil rights movements and now more recently with George Floyd, that question resonates. But I think that question must also resonate here in Africa. I also find it interesting, and I'll leave it out there, that countries who stand up the most for their diasporas tend to have their diasporas very respected, wherever they may be. I give you as examples Israel and India. And I think the question then is there some connection between the way that we in Africa treat our own and the way that we then get treated elsewhere? I also want to raise in this context the question of migration. Africans over the years have spoken with their feet and they have migrated. And there was a crisis, of course, in Europe just a few years ago with the combination of Middle Eastern and African migration. Post-COVID, where African economies will suffer, joblessness will rise, there is a real, very real risk of mass migration to Europe at a scale unprecedented compared to what has happened in the past. What impact will that have in Europe, and how will Europe and its political systems react to that?
Thanks a lot, Karim. You have already given us some good ideas. And with this, we go to our last guest here, Femi. Femi, you are based in Tanzania. And there is something interesting that Michael Novak used to say. In the old days, the duty of people could be summed as PPO, that is pay, pray, and obey. Perhaps today is a little bit different. Is pay, jail, and die. Because, well, I mean, the situation we are facing, and much more with COVID, is making our breathing even more and more difficult. Or you are breathing down there specifically now. Femi, what can you tell us to set the stage? And we'll come back to you later for more ideas and yeah, more ideas and basically way forward.
Thank you, Louis, and thank you to our fellow panelists for already setting an amazing scene for us to take up. I'm not going to say much about me. I head the academy. It's more about the academy today. And part of the ALN Academy's mission, as some of you may know and some of you may not, is to offer technical legal training and programs regarding business practices in furtherance of the rule of law and legal service delivery excellence. However, it's also our mission, and I would say my personal passion, to contribute to help shape the narrative, surrounding our continent's social, legal, economic, cultural, spiritual, and political spaces. I think this is an important space for us to be in, given who frequents the ALN family and the greater kind of legal fraternity. We have not shied away from being ambitious, both at home and abroad. And what is important, and I want to stress this point, is imagining and etching towards an Africa that we want to see. That's important. Sometimes we get kind of entrenched in the detail, which of course is all important, but we're losing the picture. What do we actually want to see? What do we actually want to focus on and work towards? And that coming together of nations and its peoples, driven by activity from the ground upwards, where we can combine our strengths, insulate against our weaknesses. Imagine our nations being held together by a legal paradigm that emanates from we the people of the continent. In other words, a restoration, Karim's mentioned this, but a restoration of Africa's systems of justice, of governance, of equity, interpreted, of course, for our 21st century realities. It's my belief, and I doubt this is controversial, but our independent settlements of the 50s and 60s locked Africa into a world order that was pretty much diametrically opposed to us becoming full members of the international community. And and perhaps we have an opportunity to put things right. And so turning to COVID-19, the pandemic has kind of inadvertently provided pretty much the entire globe, which is a much needed space to breathe, to contemplate and to look that much deeper from within. And it's the irony is that yet within this period, we have encountered episodes of, real darkness. And now these dark episodes are not new. The murder of individuals and so on have been going on for years by officials and so on and so forth. But, and on other occasions, these things may have been just taken as the ordinary course of negativity. But, this time, the cold-blooded murder of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, and many others. And we're talking about the USA, and I'm hoping there's going to be discussions about, what about the murders of Africans? Does it create that groundswell of disgust in the same way? But these murders have struck a deep chord in the global mindset. And we've seen a kind of collective anger that's been unleashed, some may say in an unprecedented manner. And a call for racial justice and the augmented call for equity. Equity is a big issue here, historic as well as current. And none of us, in my view, should waste this opportunity. We must recall the countless abuses that are perpetrated, but not simply public officials. And here's the thing, it's not just about public officials. The abuses that happens within the confines of our private spaces, hidden from the camera, where very often our mothers, our sisters, the girl children are harmed. Yeah. So equity, in my view, and restorative justice, I believe, is humanity's hope for the future. And, and in lots of ways, our continent, notwithstanding the many challenges, has demonstrated its abilities at critical moments to deploy its kind of deep-seated wisdoms along this. And, Ubuntu, Ubuntu, a person is a person because of other persons. This is a central tenet that, in lots of ways pervades the entirety of our continent. And quite frankly, our continent has probably survived because of those things that are the underbelly. But the crucial thing is, we are beyond survival, and it's time to bring, our epistemological and ontological kind of learnings to the fore so that they can take center stage and provide and infuse not just our systems, but to provide positive global influence. And so just to cap it off, the ALN Academy is committed to doing its part alongside, like-minded institutions and individuals as a collective to redress the imbalances and asymmetries, of our global system. And quite frankly, together we are big and bold enough to turn imaginations into realities.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Femi. You have said something very interesting, that is, and this came also from a participant. Perhaps there is no increase in racial discrimination, but technology allows us to see it now, real time, as it happens, and it spreads all over with no filters by the big media houses, which perhaps have had a role to play in this setting. Now, something very interesting also that you put across was the issue of the economic impact of racial discrimination. And this takes me to something quite interesting that I want to ask Nana Oto-Oyote, whom we heard about. She told us something at the very beginning. Nana, there is something dramatic going to happen. It's an economic tsunami for Africa. There is an economic crisis coming in the developed world due to certainly to COVID. I mean, COVID, as we know, is not only a health pandemic, but it's going to be economic and social as well. And this will affect radically and drastically the remittances, which is the money Africans in the diaspora are sending back to Africa. The aid money which we do not like too much in Africa because these things don't pay, and that's something I will ask Karim later, is also going to be reduced due to less revenue in these developed countries. So Africa is going to stagnate financially and to starve financially due mostly to those remittances. How do you see it from here? And what is your experience in forward in this regard?
Thank you very much. In fact, it's quite interesting that you're talking, asking about remittances. And I think for me, going back to, again, COVID and its impact on diaspora communities, we are seeing clearly that, particularly in UK, there's been huge mortality within BME communities because, again, we have been at the forefront of the pandemic in working as health professionals, working in supermarkets, working in all places that puts people at risk. So what has happened with the COVID and its impact has been that a lot of Black people, you know, from the diaspora have experienced mortality, but also a lot of them have also lost jobs. And so we are seeing those who were working as, you know, in informal occupations, as taxi drivers, even those who are cleaners. Offices are closed, so that then means that people who would do all those cleaning jobs are no longer having access. And by the way, quite a lot of them also, we will call them here called undocumented. So if you are not documented, you don't have access to all the perks and the welfare system that protects you. So again, there are issues for diaspora who will then remit monies. A lot of these remittances, some would go through these normal channels of, you know, Western Unions and the like. So you can even be able to calculate the amounts that go into different spaces. But there are also those who give money because people are traveling. So, you know, with airlines down and airlines travel really gone down, we are seeing a huge challenge in terms of remittances and remittance flows. Most of these remittances that would come from diaspora communities basically help out in communities in terms of survival, health, education, and basic bits of businesses here and there. So we're told now the World Bank is actually setting up to say that, hang on, we're going to have an issue. They're seeing that migrant workers who are no longer able to remit, the World Bank is predicting that we're going to get about 23% fall in remittances in Africa. I was recently watching Al Jazeera, and the effects are already being seen, where a lot of these money transfer companies are not even being able to give monies out because the monies are not coming in. So the reality for us is that we really have to watch these spaces. We have a situation where now DFID, as a result of so many, our new government is going to be merged with Foreign and Commonwealth Office. We have to be very clear that right now the interests of our governments in Europe are basically to look for their own. So looking for their own, which means that aid is going to be very much tied to their own interests. And so if aid is tied to their interest, where is aid going to in Africa? So there is a huge issue around aid that's going to go to Africa. We've already been told that the aid budget is going to be reduced. We are very much aware that it's going to be tied to trade. And we're also very much aware that this aid business itself has always been challenging. And now that is going to be reduced. What's going to be the implications for development in Africa? And I think for us, what is really a big issue when we look at aid is aid for issues around gender equality issues. We've been talking about the whole, you know, impact of Black Lives Matter and injustices. The injustices that women and girls face globally continue to persist. And they continue to persist because we often live in a parallel system. The parallel system where women and girls live by codes of traditional norms, traditional customs, traditional practices, where very few people have access to mainstream legal systems and justice. So again, these are the issues that we really have to unpack. What is the impact of all these things on women and girls, their survival? But again, breaking these chains require more innovative and strategic interventions by our governments, who very often also have parallel laws that discriminate against women and girls. We are seeing countries like Nigeria having a state of emergency for addressing gender-based violence, because during COVID, there's been huge rise in rape, gender-based violence, and related abuses of women. And these are going alongside other forms of abuse. I think we really have a huge problem for women who also tend to, by the way, be quite provide a lot of the remittances that go to Africa. So I think with these things, we have challenges around remittances, challenges around gender equality, the parallel system that continues to operate and oppress women, particularly women in Africa, but also in women. And other talking about technology, I would say we are seeing social media now outing some of these things. How do we back and support women who openly come out to talk about these abuses?
Fantastic. You have brought into the conversation a very interesting issue, domestic violence. Because sometimes we say, well, we can't breathe because of the racial tensions, but there are very many women and girls and children who cannot breathe in their homes because they do not have a functional home. And here I move to Sankara, asking you a follow-up on this question, that is, the Black Lives Matters is double-pronged in a way, because you say, well, there is solidarity with the African Americans who fight for racial equality, but it's also equality here in Africa against classist police brutality, against domestic violence. So we have inherited a colonial police structure, and perhaps also the colonial system, working system, where the woman stayed back home in the countryside with the children and the men came to the city to work. So the family structure somehow is fractured. And when you put them together by force, there is domestic violence. Sankara, what light can you give us in this regard? What's your experience, and what do you think should be the future of policing in African societies, or resolving these issues at the domestic level? What can we do in this regard?
So racial classification, without a doubt, is a colonial invention, and it existed primarily to allow for economic differentiation. So, and we continue to see this in society, and I rightly agree with your earlier sentiments on that. Yes, the poor people are always going to be taken advantage of by the rich people. White people seem to take advantage of Black people. And this issue is not an issue that has existed from yesterday. As we are all saying, is that this issue is rooted within the, the roots of racism are entrenched in colonialism. So how do we move forward? The way I see us moving forward is in us knowing that we all play a part. Africa does not only belong to those who are born and bred in Africa. Africa belongs to the Africans in Africa and also those outside of Africa, that is those in the diaspora, like Nana, for example. And the way I see it is that we need to begin to normalize some policies that I think if we began to normalize could help us solve the situation that is racism and the situation that is even just modern day colonialism. Businesses, organizations, corporates, firms, governments need to begin to normalize anti-modern slavery statements, for example, because these are things that continue to happen within our institutions. We do have a lot of racism in organizations that are so up there, you wouldn't even believe it. And the thing is that the people who tend to actually face a lot of these, whether it is racial discrimination or even tribal forms of discrimination or gender, is women. And the only way for us to figure this out is to ensure that we all begin to educate ourselves, whether it's in things such as, transcendental anthropology. You want to, we all need to start asking ourselves, why do we exist? If we go towards what Femi has earlier alluded towards, the concept of Ubuntu, the concept of socialism, these are things that we need to start educating ourselves and we need to start rising against. The truth is that if I am racially discriminated today and I don't rise up and say no, or I don't rise up and document it, or I don't rise up and speak up against it, the truth is that we are just enablers. So we do have a good majority of people within our society that are enablers, and because we enable this, it continues. So in other words, we continue to just perpetuate the cycle that is racism. Then over time, after it is already too late, we have an issue. Institutions such as the ICC, for example, have often been blamed for the African bias that seems to more often than not be against our African leaders more than they are against other leaders from a different continent. And these are things that we see. These are things that we have continued to enable and give permission to continue to be perpetrated against us. The role for women within society is not to only procreate. The role for women within society is not to be silent. The role for women in society is not to just be trampled upon, or for women to not have a voice, or for women to not only either stay in the kitchen if you want to go down to the traditional gender norms. That is not the role for women. Women have to be involved in the policy creation. We have to be a part of the solution because we are part of the solution. And I think that is what I would say around that. And the issue of Black Lives Matter and how it's just entrenched in colonialism, to be honest, is should also on another hand, be looked at as, have we really gotten over colonialism? Have we gotten over the roots of colonialism? Because the colonialist is long gone. Yes, physically we don't see them, but the truth is that within our systems, within our governments, within even constitutions that we inherited from our colonizers, the truth is that they are still in existence. So are we able to rise from that? And I don't have a direct answer for that. Maybe I'll throw it to one of the panelists, but we need to ask ourselves, which is going to be the way forward? What are we normalizing? What do we need to stop normalizing? And what is it that we can actually tolerate within the continent?
Fantastic. Although I disagree with you that you are not part of the solution, you are the solution. Really, in Africa, traditionally, really, it has been up to the mother to pull things through. When men were drinking, anyway, this is a touchy topic that maybe I should not bring up. But with this, I want to ask Dexter. There was a very interesting comment that we try to somehow throw on the floor here. When one of the participants said that there is no real increase in racial discrimination now, but it's more noticeable because of better technology and things. Instances of discrimination are exposed and reach everywhere. Dexter, given your experience in this field and all the data you hold, do you think that's the case? And what can you tell us about it?
I think it's a valid point, and it looks superficially attractive, Louis, but I think we need to first make a critical distinction. So the first empirical distinction we need to make is the salience of an event like what happened to George Floyd in Minnesota, the traction that it had internationally is because, as my colleague said on the chat box, it was recorded. We have seen it, and what we have seen cannot be unseen. So many of the cases I've done over the last 30 years, the struggle has been, as a painstaking struggle which taken months in court with officials of the state to try to demonstrate factually to a jury that they have, without any kind of justification, killed a person of color. That's been the struggle, and time and time again, we've done that. But with George Floyd's case, there is no dispute. We have seen it. We cannot unsee it. So yes, I think technology does have an impact. So we then need to make a distinction and look at the data and follow the empirical trail. What actually has happened? there has been an upsurge in racial violence. When has that happened? It has happened in particular in the second half of the last decade. So it is no coincidence that you've got a number of epiphenomena all together, clustering together. If we look at the rates of racial violence, and then we look at and we map it against the economic catastrophe of 2008, the stresses, the social stresses that caused, the retrenchment economically that was a result, the effects on society, particularly in the global north, and I'm talking about in terms of racial attacks and violence. And then you get an upsurge in the middle part of the decade and afterwards. And it's no coincidence that's happening in the United Kingdom, Brexit, in the United States with Trump. And there is a feeling of permissiveness, that it is acceptable to have these kinds of conversations, these thoughts, these sentiments, and these narratives. In London, Louis, you'll know very well that one of the pushbacks against Black Lives Matter and the demonstrations in support of that in the United Kingdom was that we had these groups of racists who call themselves statue defenders congregating around statues of colonial figures in London, so-called defending them and making Nazi salutes and saying, I'm racist and I am proud. Now, you wouldn't have had that a decade and a half ago. So something has changed. And I think a good analysis and something that people might want to look at is if you think about Francis Fukuyama. Fukuyama, very famously, at the end of the 80s, with the fall of communism, wrote his memo about the fact that it's the end of history. In other words, he believed at that point we've got the inevitable triumph of liberal values of democracy and tolerance. He's now revisited that idea and said, well, I think I'm wrong. I think that there has been a material change in the whole structure of society globally in the last half decade. And that is reflected in the evidence and in the data about racial attacks, not only against Black people and people of color, BAME people in the United Kingdom, but as I indicated, about Jewish people as well. So it isn't, I don't think, an artifact of better technology and better reporting, though that is part of it. I think there is something far more substantial and far more important happening as well. Can I just make one more point, Louis, which is in response to Nana, and she makes a vital point about the way in which all of this is impacting upon women and girls. As Nana knows, I work a lot with fantastic organizations, the United Kingdom, to change the law on female genital mutilation. We did so. We were able to do that. I wrote a report to Parliament looking at the United Kingdom's woeful history of protecting women and girls from that kind of social control through their sexuality and the reduction of girls to their biological essence, which needs to be contested. Since lockdown has happened in the United Kingdom, which for us was towards the end of March, I have worked virtually every single day in court doing cases of what? Domestic abuse. So there has been such a spike in domestic abuse cases that our chambers in London, which I'm proud to say Femi was, and I think you still are, Fem, a member of, and I shared a room with Femi for many years. Our chambers, Fem, we've opened a helpline because the access to justice for women and girls and children as well, being locked up with their abusers, the system was breaking down. And because of the confinement, it went through the roof. And that's what I've been doing. I've been doing it actually, Louis, for whatever it is, 3, 4, 5 months now. I've just been sitting. We've been doing it all, or most of it, like this on videos. And I've just been doing case after case after case, trying to protect women and young girls and children from domestic abuse. Now, it's not just women and children and girls who are victims, of course, men can be, and I had a case a few weeks ago like that. But the vast majority of victims are the most vulnerable, and it is gendered. It is gendered. So I would agree completely with Nana about that. And we need to understand that that is one of the effects. And what I think, trying to decode it, what I think actually happens is that in times of social stress, you've got two things happening. You've got a reversion in terms of this nostalgic idea of trying to revert to a fantasy of a better white society. And so you need to understand, I think, how it is people are thinking about the white tribe. I think that's very important. The second facet I think we need to understand, I'll end with this. The second thing we need to understand is how in times of social stress, it almost organically, it will find out the points of weakness and those who have least access to power and resources and protection. And that is why you see violence against migrants, violence against women, violence against children, violence against people of color. That is what's happening.
Thanks a lot, Dexter. Very relevant. And this leads me to a question for Karim. Karim, you told us in your first intervention that you have been dealing with commercial law across Africa and with the whole corporate system. Annabel Lima argues that Africa in itself is barely breathing. So when all this happened, it was an expression of something that was already going on, as we have, as Dexter and Sankara and Nana have told us already. Now, in 2015, this is a scandalous figure. This is quite deeply annoying. In 2015, while African countries received $161 billion from abroad in terms of loans, personal remittances, and aid, 203 billion were taken from the continent through corporations repatriating profits, cost impositions, or illegal money trafficking. That means that there is a net loss for the continent of $41.3 billion dollars in 1 year. I mean, this is an incredible amount of money. And so somebody, one of the participants, put across a question that, well, aid has been a sort of a crunch for the African countries, as well as a way of Western world keeping us somehow down. And I say keeping us because I'm a Kenyan, and I'm also thinking here of my African grandmother. So what can you tell us? What's the problem here? What's the solution? What will happen, for example, with the debt and financing industry? And how can we remodel this sort of scenario that is constantly perpetuating the I can't breathe from an economic point of view?
Thanks, Luis. Yeah, I mean, I think there are many reasons why Africa can't breathe, and one of them is, of course, this debt burden, massive debt burden. But when one looks historically at this, as you know, towards the end of the 20th century and early into this century, there was a big campaign to cancel African debt. And a number of countries, the so-called HIPC countries, benefited from debt cancellation. The story since then hasn't been great, because most of those countries have now got debt levels equal to or greater than their historic debt levels. But when one looks at the Human Development Index and you compare how those countries who had their debt cancelled have done relative to those African countries whose debt has not been cancelled. We see little or no difference, which is frankly remarkable, because you would have thought that the extra fiscal space that came from debt cancellation would have been put to good use. Now, some of that African governments must take responsibility for. There's no question that they have misused their money either through corruption or bad management. But there are also other factors. So, terms of trade, Africa does very badly in terms of global trade dynamics under the whole WTO regime. Some of you will be aware, of course, of the AFCFTA, the African Free Trade Continental Free Trade Area, which, in theory, should enable us to trade with each other more effectively, but also to be able to negotiate as a group vis-a-vis other trading blocs. But we have found it difficult to cooperate. So, and we can't always blame others. So the most recent example, of course, is in relation to COVID. And looking at the East African community, we have been unable, even as a community, to come up with a single policy response to COVID. As many of you know, we have a country within East Africa that denies that it has COVID at all. But it shares common borders with many other countries within the community. Now, this is very difficult. And when you don't want to rely on data and science, this is where you end up. A couple of other points. Environmental degradation. Probably the most singular example of the impact of climate change on the planet to date is the massive impact of the hurricanes in Mozambique. More than 1 million people displaced. And Africa has not had a cogent policy response to that. Finally, mineral resources and extraction. So the data you quoted, Luis, about debt versus extraction. Mining contracts and natural resource contracts are probably the worst example of that, where the terms of trade that African governments have struck mean that very little is left in the continent. So I think these are some of the reasons why Africa can't breathe. Okay, but unless we organize better, right, and have leadership that is more alert and aware to the threats and challenges that face us as a continent, I fear that some of these trends will continue.
Thanks a lot, Karim. Very, very interesting, and we'll hear more about this in a minute. But Femi, Karim brought out something quite interesting, and it's the denial we see not only in Africa, in some African countries, but around the world, in certain regimes, on the seriousness of COVID. And these denials or type of denials are not very new, because it's what somehow happens when there is no transparency in governance, and perhaps leaders do not feel they are accountable. What's the relationship you would see, or what can you tell us in a very few words on between transparency, accountability, and this I can't breathe? I mean, how do you see it from where you sit, and what do you think could make the situation improve in this regard?
Obviously be mindful of how I couch this, but I'm in a particular country that views things in a special way. Let's put it that way, and it is disconcerting. No two ways about it. I suppose what difficult from many of us on the ground, who have particular contacts to individuals who certainly have no allegiance to government and what have you, depicting a situation where, firstly, there's no denial that a pandemic is in our midst, but provide the underground intelligence that they understand. And I'm talking about, high up medical officers and so on and so forth. Some of them not from the country, so again, no allegiance. Some of them leaving the country, so no allegiance, who basically are saying the country actually is dealing with it reasonably well. So it begs the question, a couple of questions arise out of this. Why not be transparent in those particular types of circumstances, which would actually back and augment what it is you want to say? There's a lot of distrust within the continent amongst ourselves. And I think that definitely is a legacy of colonialism that we certainly need to address quickly. We just don't have the time. Yesterday I was in a meeting and I heard a phrase that I hadn't come across before. And it's in relation to the youth, and it's called waithood. I'll repeat that, waithood. It's the phenomenon where young people are waiting for the older generation to simply die off because they've had enough. And this is pertinent. On the one hand, the older generation, and that's in a spectrum, should be the custodians of our wisdoms within our cultures. They are there. They have not disappeared. They have not. And that's the thing that we've got to hold on to. You've spoke, Louis, earlier of the plight of the indigenous persons within Australia. Yeah, look at Africa. Africa still thrives in terms of its population. We have survived and we are thriving in that respect. So we clearly have within our systems mechanisms that provide a genius of survival, but now we have to go beyond. And there have been in our more recent history attempts to bring ourselves together. Karim talked about the discordance, and that's happened over time, even in better times, if you like, in terms of leadership. And I don't want to cast aspersions at any particular leader, but at times where we have had a kind of more vibrant, if you like, leadership, there were still, loggerheads. We know of them, but now we just don't have the time for that. We really need to hone in on the best of what we have on the continent, to, as I said earlier, to bring that to the fore. Because, a lot of what we're talking about and what Dexter is talking about sits within our psyches. We understand the kind of individualized impacts of our psychologies, but somehow we don't bring that to a collective level. We have to, as Fanon has said and others, we decolonize the mind. We have to, and not just as a reactive thing, because then what then? What do we replenish our minds with? And that's the thing, is to look within what we have. We have wonderful, wonderful technicians. We have wonderfully skilled individuals. We have innovative people. But it's how do we anchor that together under a system that's cohesive, coherent, and that we can, it can become the underbelly of a continent. I just want to touch on one issue about trade and how, the African Free Continental Trade Agreement is, if you like, a symbolic reference to where we could head. At the moment, I think Karim's right. It's more symbolism at the moment, and there's a lot to work on. But you know what? We've started. And for all those nations, in terms of humanity, 500 years is nothing. One person, I was listening to a wonderful lecture where they said, in relation to, the human existence, 500 years is very slim. In relation to the Earth's existence, if you were to do 24 hours, it's less than a fraction of a second. So to that extent, 500 years and planning, China plans, India plans, and the fruits of that planning begins to yield. It's for us to now plan. The colonialism was a plan, guys. The 1880s, the Berlin Conference, it was a plan. We're living that through now. So what's our counter? Let's devise plans to counter and come up with something new that doesn't just infuse ourselves, but infuse a new paradigm. Because, their plan is not working either. In America, in Europe, there's so many problems.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Well, you have told us to wait for 500 years. I don't big worry. But
the planning.
I will get back to you because Dr. Susie Dattenberg and also Edward Luke from Botswana, imagine, have brought up some interesting points on policies that relate to public and private space, but we'll come back to that. There is another question here from one of the participants. Sadly, I missed the name, for Nana. Well, and she thanks Nana and Sankara for their bright and wonderful insights. But to Nana specifically, how do we sustain this conversation and retain the focus on these real issues, race, gender? There's usually a predisposition, and I will explain it like this, for us to get excited, build statues. I mean, we have very many places called Martin Luther King, and we have statues of Martin Luther King, and then we forget about the issue after a while. So there is a predisposition on this, and it could end up a topic that no one follows through. So how do we ensure that we do not perpetuate this enablist mentality, and at the same time we maximize on how best to effectively act to make an impact?
Thank you very much, Louis. I think for me, one of the things that has been very clear has been the need to build partnerships. Because like we're talking about the whole issue of Ubuntu, it's the same way that people have to come together. And we always look at Africa and this, he said, if you need to go far, you have to work together. So the whole issue is about really working together and working together on these issues. Partnerships take time, but it really, really makes sense. And looking at even this platform, we're seeing people from the diaspora really also linking up with those in Africa. How do we build on our strengths? If you look at Black Lives Matter, it started as, Black Lives Matter were young people who were talking about lesbian and gay related issues. It has become a big platform on really looking at race and all the intersectional inequalities around, ethnicity, gender, and all these things that are coming together. So yes, we can work together. And I think it's about really looking at where we can add value to each other. And that there's always been this whole issue around, competition. And when it comes to my sector, working in the charity sector, it's very much about competition because we are all, chasing the same funds. But it's about really looking at where is our vision, how can we have a collective vision and walk towards that collective vision. One of the things that has really become very real for us in UK, and particularly in our work, is the whole issue of building leadership capacity. Creating spaces for particularly young women to be able to understand the nuances of some of these issues and really bringing together people's lived experiences so that you can build on their lived experiences to really move forward on these kinds of agenda. Because at the end of the day, when we look at all these issues, we ask ourselves, who is having access to talk? And who are those who have been left behind? And we really see that in all of these conversations, we talk about technology. It's so easy for us to be on this platform and use virtual conversations. There are people who don't have access to internet. They can even use their phones because their phones are not smartphones. So we are really seeing that we are leaving a lot of people behind. How do we sort of reach out to those that have been left behind and create the spaces? One of the biggest challenges in Africa, we don't talk about disability. We don't reach to the needs of those who are disabled. How do we reach these people who, I mean, what kind of messages we're looking at COVID? How do you send messages to people who are, you know, who have a disability, who can't even read? You know, we're really seeing that we've lost a lot. And then the other bit that I really want to look at is also interrogating policies. What are the policies that are in place, and how do we take action around collective push for policies that are more focused around equality, focused around inclusiveness, and also focused around empowerment? A lot of times, these are the things that really make people uncomfortable, because those who have privileges and those who have power do not want to lose their power. How do we engage on these issues and bring these issues back on the table? And I'm very clear that one of the things that we are seeing has been the whole use of, again, technology to talk about the issues of, for example, sexual abuse. We're seeing young women from the diaspora in particular now talking about abuse that has been historical abuse that they've never spoken about because of the use of technology. But at the same time, very often when people use these media, sometimes also they get a lot of backlash. Where is the support for these women and young people who come out? How do we ensure that we are reaching out to those who are most vulnerable? And these spaces often do not allow us to really engage equally with those who are most vulnerable. And I think one of the things that I really want to also bring on board is the whole issue of the diaspora. Africa is very, when we talked about, I think it was, I'm not sure whether it was Louis who mentioned, I mean, you look at the Indian diaspora and you look at, you know, the Jewish diaspora, and how that has really made a difference because they were engaged and really built on the expertise and specialism, but also the funding. But at the same time, what we're seeing in Africa is that we are not engaging enough the diaspora. Once the diaspora come in, we only come in for remittances. When it comes interest of policy engagement and even looking at development interventions, the diaspora are seen as, oh, these are the people who are coming to be the opposition. So there isn't those kind of critical engagement of the diaspora, and we're missing out a lot. Africa goes beyond those who are just living in Africa, and the diaspora are making such huge strides. You look at UK, look at the US, African diaspora really, really are wealth of talent. But I have a big issue now with young people from the diaspora who don't seem connected. A lot of young people in the diaspora do not see connected in Africa. They don't see the links in Africa. They see their families are from Africa. And we need to watch. We're going to get a situation where the young people are not interested in remittances. Because for them, it's like, what's all the big deal? You know, they don't have the same links with Africa as we who saw ourselves as being born in Africa. So we have a challenge, and we need to watch how we build on the interest of young people in the diaspora, because they are more tech savvy, they have more skills. How do we link them up and create that kind of link again in Africa such that we build on these strengths? Because the Black people see themselves, particularly young Black Africans, they see themselves as they don't belong here, they don't belong there, and seem to be lost in these whole conversations around Black Lives Matter. So how do we create the platforms so that young people can continue to be engaged in these platforms? And for us, I see, particularly for young women, they are also going through a lot of trauma and a lot of identity issues. How do we build on these issues and support and create the platform that would enable these conversations to be taken wider than just where we have the privilege of really engaging? But one of the things that has been very clear, the young people can mobilize. The young people have access. How do we learn from some of these skills that they've used such that we can build on this momentum that the young people have created?
Excellent, fantastic. And this brings us to decolonization. And it's not only decolonizing structures, but even our minds. And here I jump to Sankara, because Nana mentioned something very interesting, that, well, we have to change our perceptions. If not, time will change us. And that link between the diaspora and Africa will be lost, will be destroyed. So we have to think, perhaps it's a very serious conversation going on decolonizing our education, our industries, our governance structures. And in a globalized world, do you think this is possible? And this question comes from the floor, from one of the presenters, one of the participants. Is it, do you think it is possible? And if so, how would we do it without isolating ourselves from the world? Meaning decolonizing is not ignoring the realities. And on the contrary, more than approaching it from a negative perspective of leave me alone, it could be very positive of I will take you over because I'm younger, I'm stronger, and we are more. So that sort of Wakanda mentality that sometimes we don't have, and that's why perhaps that movie was so powerful and so popular. What can you tell us in this regard, Sankara?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. That's a very good question. It's also a critical question. The truth is that decolonization is possible, but we have to begin with the decolonization of our own minds. You know, if you read the book Why Nations Fail by Acemoglu, you will realize that he was able to map the trend of how the world has moved, why some countries are better off than other countries. But that does not mean that countries do not need each other. That does not mean that this battle of decolonization, or even this struggle of decolonization, has to be taken up by one country alone. The way I see it is that Black Lives Matter is not a moment, it's a movement. And courtesy of it being a movement, it means that there's going to be subsections of people from different parts of the country, from different parts of the world. That means that the people, for example, can pick it up, you know, and pivot it towards the things and the matters that they are seeing within their context. On the African continent, Black Lives Matter on our end is going to mean that we are not going to stand racism. We are not going to stand segregation, whether courtesy of being young, age, or whether courtesy of gender. So I do think that it is very possible for us to do that. And where we start is in education, information, knowledge. Knowledge is power. If we begin by structuring our education systems, our political systems, our religious systems, our governance systems, as well as our economic systems, it's going to be very possible for us to decolonize. Because the truth is that, as I earlier said, is that we have inherited a lot of our societal structures. And because of that, these structures do not exist for us. The battle, or rather, this particular decolonization process, this stage we are in, as Femi has said, is going to require planning. Those who are ahead of us, who are older, immediately experience the effect of colonialism. The truth is that it is the role of the young people on the continent to now begin to decolonize, to now begin to set up structures and systems that can cater for a tomorrow that is clean, a tomorrow that, that has no influences from whether you are Francophone or Anglophone. It is going to be the responsibility of the young people, the youth on the continent. And I think it's going to start with education. The access to justice is also a key thing. You know, a majority of the time, access to justice is very expensive. Capital punishment is for those who don't even have capital, you know, it seems like it, not only abroad, but also on the continent of Africa. And one of the ways for us to begin to do that is give access, allow us to participate, allow young people, allow women and girls, allow the young men of Africa, the older men of Africa, make it inclusive, make it, a process that allows for everybody to plug in. I think it is very possible. Is it going to be achieved, say, even, I'm not just thinking that Ghana was the first country to achieve independence in Africa. And if you look at the things, the ongoings and the goings on of Ghana, there's not so much difference from even some of the countries that, achieved independence much later. And so colonialism is is, say, the fabric. It's the foundation of a majority of our African countries, but that is not our narrative. We existed before the white people came here. We existed before people came and began to colonize, before people came and started to take away things that belong to Africa. You know, we existed before, and we had a way of life. We had a system. Yes, right now we do have a lot of social media. We do have a lot of young people. So can young people leverage on that? We can come together as a force, and we are a movement. We can continue, and those who will come after us are going to plug into that. So I do think that decolonization is very possible, but it's going to take quite a lot. A majority of it is going to be the willpower of every single person in Africa and outside of Africa that is African. That's what I think.
Fantastic, thanks a lot. And here I will set you, Sankara, against Dexter, because looking at it from the other side of the sea or the mountains or the desert, you from the UK, is decolonization possible? I mean, would you also say that, what would you say about that, since you are part of those who colonized us, so to speak, even though you were not there at that time?
Hang on. They colonized my parents' country, the country I was born in, my friend. I happen to be an interloper on this, I was going to say foggy island that Caesar saw, but it's actually burning in extreme heat for us at the moment, as you know. But yeah, the question of colonization, absolutely critical. I'm speaking to and advising one of the universities here in the United Kingdom about this very question, about how can they decolonize the curriculum. And, you know, it's a massive, massive issue. One thing I'd like to put on the table for everybody to consider, and it's something that Sankara was quite rightly mentioned, about knowledge is power. Now, knowledge is power is a phrase that was created by an Englishman, Francis Bacon. In fact, the first ever Queen's Counsel appointed special advisor to Queen Elizabeth here in the late 1500s, early 1600s. So the Baconian theory, or the Baconian conceptualization of power, is that knowledge, if you've got knowledge, you can get power. I would ask you to consider and think of as well how that is flipped. And Michel Foucault, the French thinker, said we should also think about how exactly the opposite is the case, how power is knowledge. In other words, what you have is a monopoly or a dominance of power creating what constitutes legitimate narratives, what constitutes legitimate knowledge, what constitutes what Foucault says are games of truth. What is accepted as truth? What is accepted as knowledge? And that's the problem. If anyone wants to think about, and it was interesting that one of the contributors spoke about, well, can we change our perceptions of colonialism? Where do perceptions come from? And it was some of these questions that I went to Harvard and tried to spend some time thinking at Harvard about exactly these issues. Where do perceptions come from? Attitudinal issues. Is the fact of us having a colonized mind just a matter of choice? And I think the answer is not straightforward, but the answer almost certainly is it is not. If you want to grasp just how deep-rooted and intractable, how stubborn and persistent racialized thinking is, colonized powers and thoughts are, I invite everybody to, when we finish today, if they haven't seen it before, to go onto YouTube. There's a video which I think lasts 1 minute 39 seconds. And you will see in just over a minute and a half just how powerful racialized thinking is. It's a video that's called Black Doll, White Doll. I've seen it hundreds of times, and every time, Louis, that I watch it again, I'm shocked. Because what it shows, it's a replication actually of the famous experiments that were done in the United States when they were having the landmark Kate of Brown and the Board of Education about trying to end segregation in the United States. And in the experiment, you will see there are black children who are given a choice between whether they want to play with a white doll or a black doll. And the vast majority of the black children choose a white doll. And the reason that they choose the white doll, the reasons are heartbreaking, because the white doll is good, the white doll is nice, because the black doll is bad. And then they're asked, which is the doll like you? And of course, they choose the appropriate one. So one of the things that I'm also trying to do, given how deeply entrenched these conceptualizations of social space are, is to try to think about how in the United Kingdom, we can try to de-racialize the criminal justice system. Because, I go back to what Femi said. Femi, it seems to me, my friend, you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about we shouldn't just obsess and focus upon individual corrupt officials within the system or officials and officers who have abused their power. And it's what another thinker I'd invite people to look up when we finish, called Loïc Wacquant, who's French as well, but is professor at Berkeley in California. And what Wacquant said, and he was a successor of Bourdieu, another great thinker. Bourdieu tells us there's no such thing as racism, which is a shocking thought. What Bourdieu tells us is there is not racism, but racisms with a plural. And you have to understand the historical nuance, because as you know, most people here, I hope, know that biological race does not exist. It is a myth. And we've known that it doesn't exist for a long time. When the Human Genome Project reported in 2003, we finally had the entire blueprint of the human DNA, the human code. And one of the things that the experts went out of their way to emphasize was that race as a biological and scientific concept does not exist. And so Femi and myself may be just as closely connected in terms of DNA to a blonde person in Scandinavia than that person in Scandinavia is to someone in France or Germany, because there is no such thing as pure race. And then the question arises, the fundamental question arises that seems to me at the very heart of everything we're talking about today. If race does not exist, if it is not a valid biological and scientific concept, how is race and racism one of the most important forces on the planet? And that is because it is something that is socially produced to legitimize power structures. And I'm just going to end with this thought. I didn't really understand this because and the sequencing is important. I didn't understand this till at the beginning of my legal career. I was representing anti-apartheid activists in London. There was a 24/7 vigil outside South Africa House in Trafalgar Square in the centre of London, protesting against apartheid. And one of the main reasons I went to the bar and became a human rights lawyer is because I wanted to be part of that struggle. And I represented people who were arrested, people from the ANC, people from SWAPO, who were protesting there and were arrested by the police and beaten up and charged with public order offences. And what they said about apartheid is, listen, apartheid isn't produced by race or racial differences. Apartheid, as Sankara, I think, said, in terms of other forms of exploitation, apartheid was a system of economic, social exploitation that was legitimated by race. And it's a rubber stamp and a justification. And it's vital that people get that sequencing right, and understanding therefore the sequencing, understanding that it's socially produced, and understanding that the first step is we have to start challenging it in ourselves and clearing away this kind of constant messaging and indoctrination. That is how we can start to change it. I'm going to stop there, Louis.
Oh, no, no, fantastic. And you see, this somehow comes across in Animal Farm, how the animals' personalities and natures change depending on the political convenience of the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
2 legs beta, 4 legs bad, 4 legs beta, 2 legs bad, etc.
Well, that's you know, the book I wrote, and I couldn't read it out today because it's 816 pages or whatever it is. So I'm not taking up your invitation, Louis, at the outset. But 10 types of human. What I was trying to do is to understand two different facets. On the one hand, there is great flexibility in human nature. But on the other hand, there are biological things that are inherited, but they are not, and this is the thing to remember, they are not racially inherited. They are not passed down because of race. They're passed down because of our common humanity. Actually, concepts like ostracism, concepts like our deep need to nurture children, all of those things, which I deal with in the book, these are common to us irrespective of skin color.
Yeah, very true, very good. Karim, there is a very interesting comment and question from Bolahan Elias, who is from ALN Nigeria. So he's there perhaps still in the morning or maybe in the early afternoon. And he says something very interesting. Western governments have brought in advance virtually all they have bought all the vaccines that will be made before 2022. Where will we be in Africa? I know you are not a doctor, but you know about value of goods and specifically in this case, health. And then the second thing that is very interesting, is there any hope of getting relief for the foreign borrowings that African nations have taken on as a result of the pandemic? Debt forgiveness and buying of the vaccines, strategic moves. It seems that in Africa, we may be not very good at planning for the day after tomorrow. We just look at the needs now, today. I say something very short and very interesting. At the Commonwealth, we put into place COBULRI, that is a Commonwealth business law rapid response initiative, thanks to ALN, because this initiative came from ALN and specifically from Africa, and certain law firms in the UK, pro bono, got very interested. That is reforms that have to be made in the laws, commercial law specifically, to prevent the loss of businesses and livelihoods when the economic impact comes big. Well, many countries have got interested in the Caribbean, in Asia, but somehow the developing countries do not seem to be interested, because we get interested when the tsunami is on us. Oh gosh, the economy has crashed, please help us. Then we borrow money from the World Bank and we get into deeper debt. But anyway, Elias is talking about very interesting things: foreseeing and foresight and debt release for African countries. What can you tell us about it?
Thank you, Luis. Let me start with the question of vaccines. President Kagame said something very interesting in an interview 2 or 3 days ago about how African countries needed to buy the vaccines together, because if 54/55 countries were to negotiate with drug companies and so on, they would be much better placed in the fight to get sufficient numbers. And to be clear, sufficient numbers means billions and billions of vaccines for the continent. So the question then is, will Africa get organized enough to bulk buy, right? That's what really what he's talking about, rather than being picked off individually, which will likely result in most of us getting access to vaccines very late in the day. So I think it again comes back to whether African countries can organize themselves sufficiently in the fight to get access to vaccines. Now, on the question of debt, this is just, it's fascinating and complicated. The sources of debt now are much greater than they were in the past. In the past, our main providers of debt were either the multilateral organizations or some limited amounts of bilateral debt. Now, African countries have been able to access the global capital markets, and many African countries have Eurobonds. Just during this COVID crisis, the IMF and the World Bank have opened up large lines of credit for African countries. Will these debts be forgiven as quickly as they were granted? I doubt it. Why do I say that? I say that because of the point I made earlier. The debt relief program, data suggests that the debt relief program, to the extent that it applied to the HIPC countries in Africa, was essentially a failure. The African countries did not make better use of the excess fiscal space they had as a consequence of debt relief the last time round. So I guess the real question is, can they do a better job this time? This is also being tied up with a very interesting question that sort of links the Black Lives Matter movement, because we've called this a Chinese virus. And across many parts of the world, including in some parts of Africa, there's now a sense in which people are saying, well, it's time to tell the Chinese that they caused this, and therefore we shouldn't pay their debts back. Now, there's a whole different debate about China and Africa, but the question I'd put to the audience, to my panelists and the audience as a whole, is that's a difficult argument to make, because if one thinks of the long-range consequences of that, what will happen when there is in fact an African virus? And of course, we all know that viruses don't have ethnicities. They're just viruses. And so I think it's interesting how sort of racial tropes have now worked their way into bilateral economic discussions. I want to, if I may, Louis, very briefly stray outside the lane you've set for me, and pick up on this point that Dexter made about, and also picks up on what Nana and Sankara have been talking about. This idea that race is not sort of biologically coded in that sense, but is essentially an instrument of domination and used as an instrument of domination and social control. And of course, it goes back millennia, and I think there's a human tendency to control either on grounds of tribe, race, but in Africa also particularly on grounds of gender. And there've been a few comments in the chat about, well, how do we change a lot of this thinking? How do we decolonize the mind and also change the conversation around gender? And I think the academy has a huge role to play here. One of my great and this is my final point, one of my great frustrations about about education in Africa is it's really very, very out of date. Both the methods of education, but also syllabus. Dexter talked about the work he's been doing in trying to decolonize curriculum. In Africa today, we are still taught the history of our colonizers, as a start. So when will that change? But also functionally, the way we are taught hasn't really changed in 50 years. But of course, the world has moved on significantly since then. And so I think there's a real need to focus on appropriate and 21st century appropriate education. I'll stop there. Thank you, Luis.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Karim. And perhaps this leads us to Femi, because it's a question from Dominic Nyaga from the floor, thanking for the interesting thing that have said, also basing it on what Sankara argued, that knowledge is power. And he says, well, what is the place of the academy, of ALN, and learning institutions in equipping the youth with relevant tools which will enable them to make crucial and positive changes in society in Africa today and in the future? So Femi, I think this question falls, and taking from what Karim just told us, squarely on your ground. So we hear from you a very quick comment on this regard.
You know, these topics, they excite me and frustrate me almost in equal measure. And one of the things I think from a kind of personal point of view and the education that I received, and I'm not talking about formal education, the education I received from, you know, mentors, from people who themselves had taken, you know, great time to, you know, at the very least attempt to decolonize the mind, to be infused with authors and learnings that were not Eurocentric, that were Afrocentric, and therefore providing the ability of us to imagine something else, because that's oftentimes the problem. It's the paradigm in which we operate is kind of fixed. I'm not saying fixed completely, because of course it has, you know, elasticity. You know, the Western styled, you know, civilizations, and they're not all bad, of course not, have elasticity in them. But what's happened oftentimes is that in our education system, they've focused on holding those up as the standard bearer of philosophy, the standard bearer of all things that actually underpin far more than anything else that comes after it. So if we're talking about philosophy, we start off at the Greeks. But hold on, what about the Egyptians? And what about the Sudanese? And so on and so forth. What about the Benin Empire? What about, you know, the Ashanti kingdoms? Our children don't know about these things in equal measure. And, you know, some of us know that stuff because we've been fortunate enough, almost by a stroke of luck, to have come across people who have imparted that knowledge in us. And so from my point of view, from an academy point of view, it's incumbent upon us to be very clear in how we imagine what we want. That has to be a conversation. That's not a person's role. That is a collective discussion that needs the elders. It certainly and must be informed by our youth. They are going to take on this baton. We've been reminded of that so many times today. And many of us have been deeply affected by the past. It doesn't mean we have nothing to add to the conversation. But, you know, we have a youth that are fearless, much more fearless than we were. That's what I'm seeing. And, you know, given the right tools and given the right permissions to imagine something very different, and also have the actual baseline information. Because when I talk about Ubuntu, that's the South African iteration of that concept. It pervades Africa. So one thing that I do want to touch on, and this is also very much connected, is what holds all of this together. All of this in so many ways is that legal paradigm. You know, that's the pillar of society that brings people, structures, and so on together. And we've said it time and time again today, but I think that it needs to be rubber stamped. We need, as a parallel activity, because we can't just say we're going to pull out of the world system. That's not realistic, and I'm not positive that will, right? But as a parallel, we must develop authentic African systems of justice. They exist on the ground. You know, we were in The Hague last year providing a presentation at the World Justice Forum. And one of the presentations that we were part of came up with this statistic, which is, you know, startling, but it's the truth. when it comes to access to justice, when it comes to accessing resolutions, it is the on-the-ground solutions in the local communities that actually equal to about 90% of dispute resolution in Africa. So in fact, notwithstanding that we have a kind of colonial system that is our official system of governance, on the ground, it's not necessarily like that, but it doesn't hold tight in terms of what emanates through society in our minds. So we often see that as just, okay, this is Nakenyeji, this is just a small way of doing things. But we saw in Rwanda, the Kagache courts deal with 1.2 million cases in like 2 years. The official system would collapse. These are the things that I think are important, that when we are putting together, not just our structures of teaching technical law, but also having alongside that systems which look to how we can do things much closer to who we are and our cultures across Africa is vitally important, because that's the story that Europe has. A wonderful legal system, but born out of its people, born out of who they are as cultures. We need the same.
So we need to contextualize. Now, this leads us, we already, it's amazing, time has flown very quickly. We are finishing soon, but there is an issue here. There is the elephant in the room, and we haven't brought it out. We haven't spoken about the elephant. It's here behind me now, and I will ask Nana and Sankara to give some very brief wrap-up ideas on this elephant in the room. That is, whatever we do, we need to shift social norms that put women and girls down and build leadership capacity according to those resources for women and girls. And we have to tackle the male power, as it is called, privilege. In Kenya, I have seen it, how ever since the constitution, the new constitution came into place in 2010, we started appointing the chair a man and the deputy chair a woman. Why can it not be the other way around? How can we flip the equation? Not that we present it as a fight between men and women, but something where we are running a fair race and it is the same race. So Nana, tell us first something quick about this elephant in the room, and then Sankara, and I will call the other speakers for wrap-up ideas.
Thank you very much, Louis. I think today has been quite, I've also realized that the time has gone so very quickly. And really looking at the elephant, again, it depends on where you are and how you see the elephant. And, you know, we had this, I'm not sure whether it was a poem in school, was the blind men, and, you know, everybody saw the elephant differently depending on which part of the elephant they actually felt. So for me, clearly, the elephant is seen differently from different places, but it's visibly there. And I really want to touch on the whole issue around, let's not, you know, beat about the bush and recognize that Black Lives Matter has really drawn attention to a lot of intersecting, I would say, inequalities, which are all parallel and which all need to be looked at. So this is exciting times, and we have to sort of look at the parallel things that happen in the home, within our societies, and how women are treated at all levels. And I think this is really important that we address these social norms. And these are social norms that right from childhood, we all learn that as a girl, you are not supposed to do this. As a girl, if you're sexually abused, don't tell anybody. As a girl, if you have your period, don't tell anybody. I mean, these are issues that really make us feel different, make us feel that we are not the same, we cannot speak in certain spaces. How do we really work towards dismantling all these things that we can't, which creates that culture of we can't for women and girls? How do we break these barriers? It's really about recognizing that women have power And you cannot give somebody power. And what we are seeing that young people are taking this power and are really using it in different ways. So how do we work? For me, my last words are, how do we build leadership capacity of young people and young women? How do we create, and I think Femi brought it up somewhere, around mentorship. This intergenerational mentorship is so vital and so needed. And I think in the UK, working with young women in Tanzania, in Uganda, in Somaliland has shown the added value of young women's leadership. But I think for me, one critical bit is partnership and collaboration. You cannot do this without linking up. You've been talking about ALN. ALN may come with a very good approach to learning and training, but somebody else comes with a feminist approach. How do we marry these issues together to really bring the best of all of us and to make things work? How do we engage at higher levels, working up collectively and creating that critical mass and bringing everybody along so that we can create those spaces for equity and access to justice, but also to really address the challenges that does repeatedly makes it difficult for girls and women to breathe. This is a time for change. We need innovation. We really need to bring everybody's voice on the table, because otherwise we will be eaten on the table. So let's really make that change now. And I think for me, this is the real upbeat, last words that I bring to the conversation. So it's a pleasure being with you, and I really have loved listening to everybody. Thank you very much.
I think Nana has put everything into perspective. There is nothing else I can add towards that. I think what I would like to point out is that the conversation of young women and girls' rights, a conversation of decolonizing African minds, there were philosophers who came from Africa. Think of Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. Think of Sédar Senghor of Senegal. These are people who laid down African philosophy. This African philosophy that was laid down, we can use that fabric. We can use that as a foundation for us to continue the movement that is Black Lives Matter in our own African iteration. We also have feminism in Africa. We have leading feminists, female feminists like Chimamanda Ngozi. We also have Aisha Fofana from Sierra Leone. These are women who are leading. These are, these are women who are leading even outside of Africa, and they are leading from a point of view that is the African culture, that is the African human rights and the African even sexual reproductive health and rights, which is something we didn't even delve towards in this conversation. To wrap up, a story is told. It's not even a story, it's an actual story of the bridge in Honduras, which for a very long time, I think some of us have perhaps heard of it, was the pride of Honduras, until a storm came. After they had built this bridge, they built a bridge over a river that was a bit problematic. And then after a huge storm hit, the river changed its course. And the river did not go under the bridge anymore. It started to move beside the bridge. So they had to come back again and rebuild the bridge. So the question is, all these bridges that we are setting up in Africa, this is in the form of policies, this is in the form of rights, this is in the form of the political system, religious system, social systems. Are they ready for the iterative change that either the Black Lives Movement is gonna take, the youth in Africa are gonna take, the young women and girls are channeling and they're also going to take? We need to be ready. This is a conversation moved on from one generation to the next. We all must play our role. Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure, and I do look forward to connecting again. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Sankara. Yes, the river Choluteca. And I think it was the course was changed by the Hurricane Mitchell, which happened in the 90s. And it's very true. How many bridges are we building outside the river? Dexter, some words of wisdom to end. There is something here in America of them against us kind of conversation. And in Africa, you haven't told us anything about this, but I think you can tell us in 2 minutes what happens, because there may not be them, it's us against us.
Well, I think it's us with us and what we do to ourselves. And if you look at the history of, I mean, it's interesting that people talk about race and its been going on for millennia. There always has been othering. There has always been, ever since we emerged in Africa as social beings, and that's the key to our survival, what they call at Harvard, eusociality, the higher form of sociality that very few animal groups actually share. We share it, so do termites and ants, but it's an unusual characteristic and has led to our infestation of virtually the whole planet. If you look at what's actually happening, we've always had othering, but racism, the modern concept of race, is in fact a very new thing. It is, and I agree with Sankara, it is actually a result of colonialism, and it really started in the 1400s in Europe with two things that happened: the Spanish Inquisition, because they wanted to try to police and exclude Jewish people, and it's also was used once in the so-called Age of Discovery, when Europeans went and discovered places and peoples that have been there for thousands of years, of course, but how did they justify, if they were going to adhere to their Christian values of forgiveness and mercy, how do you justify at the same time enslaving peoples, appropriating their lands, taking their labor, taking their children, asset stripping all their resources? And you do that, and what happened was that a racial discourse was invented. And it was invented in a very particular historical context, which was about exploitation. Exploitation of where I was born, in India, with the Raj and the British Empire, in the Caribbean and the Americas, using Black people and their labor, particularly from West Africa.
Yeah.
So we need to understand that context of how race has been invented. So I think for me, the three things that we can learn from what's happened with Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd, I think we can finally use this opportunity to have an honest conversation about race, something that we haven't done before. Secondly, I think what we can do is use it in order to understand what race is and what race isn't, how it's produced and reproduced. That seems to me to be the critical step to challenge the fact that race is actually a natural phenomenon. It is not. It is a falsehood. It is a lie that is used to dominate and exploit people. And we need to use this moment, it seems to me, in order to have that conversation. And the third thing, I think, and the final thing, Louise, is this. If it is right that race is a technology of domination and exploitation that's been invented, that we've made it, and I believe it is. If that is right, what we have made, we can unmake. And I think this is what we can use this opportunity for. It's a pleasure joining you. Thank you. It's been fantastic.
Great, fantastic, and thank you for those wonderful ideas. Karim, to close, you know, it's very true that behind any valuable, powerful man, there is a mother. There is a very important person, and that is called mother, in some cases wife, etc., daughters, but the role of the mother. Can you close by telling us something? I know you come from a family where there is an incredible and impressive mother. I don't know if she's listening to this, but certainly in society we have missed something. It's as if we forgot our own mothers when it comes to doing policy, doing things, dealing with people, dealing with reality.
Thanks, Luis. Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The male patriarchal society isn't a given, right? And in fact, in Africa, we have a rich history of matriarchal societies, but we've forgotten a lot of that history and reverted to some sort of patriarchal norm, right? But in Kenya, across Africa, we have amazing examples of female leadership. In fact, I'm sitting in a room called the Wangari Maathai room, you know, as I present this, as I make my presentation. I think I'll close just with a couple of thoughts. The first thing I think is controlling the narrative is everything, right? And I think both, and so Dexter alluded to this, right? You know, power is knowledge power, and Sankara did too, or is power knowledge? But if you control the narrative, then power becomes knowledge. So I think one of the best things we can do is, you know, decolonize the mind, reform our educational system, and by doing so, prevent the distraction and deflection into tribalism, into ethnicity, into gender subjugation that our societies find themselves in. But that requires a decolonization of the mind and a reform of our education system. It's been a real pleasure. I've been so enthused and excited, both by the comments by my fellow panelists, but also by the amazing array of comments and questions on the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Karim. It has been a real pleasure. Femi, just to close, the BLM movement manifestation in Africa and education. We spoke about decolonizing the mind, but okay, we decolonize and deconstruct somehow that sort of subjugation we all have inside. But what is next? And I think this matches very much with several questions Winnie, Dominic, etc. have put across. How can we project to the future, specifically from the point of view of ALN? How do you see the ideal future in 2 sentences?
That's hard for me, you know that. Look, as I said, I think a really important starting point is the acknowledgement and creating a framework, creating that picture that we actually want to see. And then the second step is, you know, now breaking it down and having, you know, in policy terms, I mean, we've talked about some of it, you know, we need to have an education system that's fit for purpose, and that means it teaches us about who we are. So it's self-reflective. When Dexter talked about the doll, there are other examples of that. You know, sometimes it's been said that we don't read enough in Africa, but if you're reading so many books that don't look, they don't have you in them, you know, why are you going to read so much? So, you know, we have to take control of that, and we are doing that on occasions, in many occasions. So that's the first thing. And I think that we've got to be very clear as to, you know, what can bring about, you know, our togetherness, work against those aspects that really force us to kind of, you know, create all those fissures about who we are as peoples. You know, it's essential to come together and see, you know, not just the continent, but, you know, education systems as part of a project to actually gain agency, gain currency within our own sphere, far less anywhere else. Because if you can't start at home, where can you start? And I want to end with a brief quote from Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Our lives are a battlefield in which is fought a continuous war between the forces that are pledged to confirm our humanity and those determined to dismantle it, those who strive to build a protective wall around it, and those who wish to pull it down, those who seek to mold it, and those committed to breaking it up, those who aim to open our eyes, to make us see the light and look to tomorrow, and those who wish to lull us into closing our eyes. So, you know, let's, you know, empower ourselves. And let me just end on one last note. And we've talked about debt, and we've talked about, I saw a comment about, slavery and reparations. This is not just about our problem. This is a global problem. And what has happened over the last 500 years with subjugation of peoples, not just Africans, but peoples, is that there's been a lot of impunity about that. What we've seen as a direct result of the Black Lives Matter is, for example, Lloyds of London apologized and offered to compensate. It's a step forward, because you know what? They need to be restored as well. This restorative justice is not just about those who have been victims, and we must view ourselves beyond being victims. We are beyond survival. But it's also to restore, because one of the key things in this quote that I have read is, how do we confirm our humanity? That is not a black-white, as Dexter said. We are human. That is the race. That is our singular moment. There is a oneness that we must restore. Yes, it may be utopian, but that's got to be our ultimate aim. And I want to leave it on that note, because what the ALN Academy should eventually move towards is bringing that to reality within Africa and exporting what we can do at home.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Femi. It has been a terrific conversation. We thank all the participants. We tried to read most of their questions. We couldn't reach all of them. Sadly, we had very many. There are wonderful comments from Liz, all the way from Washington, from Adoa in London, from everywhere, all over the world, across all continents and all lands. It has been a fantastic time. Imagine we have been here for almost 2.5 hours, and to me, it has seemed like a few minutes. Sankara, Nana, Karim, Dexter, Femi, thank you very much. ALN team, all of you have been terrific. You have done a great job. And I see here a comment from Suzanne Ratrai that inspired me to say the final words. And she says, study, consult, act, and reflect, and the cycle repeats itself. I would just put reflect before act, but otherwise those are very inspiring words. We have to keep on pushing. We have to build that better world we all dream of. And as I usually say in this type of engagements, we cannot guarantee success, but we guarantee failure by giving up. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a great pleasure. Thank you very much, and hope to meet you again in the next webinar. Thank you, ALN team, and we are together. We keep pushing forward. Thanks a lot.